Your attention here and join with me as I open us in prayer, please. Lord God, as we pause in this moment at the beginning of a new school year, help us to realize that you are the God of new beginnings and that you have called us to this vocation. And it is a vocation that is honorable and good and a privilege to serve you in. Help us also to remember that you did not call us to this assignment to leave us on our own, but that you come alongside us. You are a yoke fellow and a fellow laborer. Therefore, we can look forward to this year with confidence, even though we know that there will be hard days ahead. And surely, as we look back at the end, whether it's the end of a school year or the end of a career, we'll be able to say, the Lord's mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen.
I asked Simeon to pray this morning. Many of you know that Simeon has announced this is his last academic years, and we thank him for his loyalty for his 30-plus years at King. Thank you, Simeon. It's good to be back with you for another exciting academic year. I'll share a lot more tomorrow, but I'm very excited and encouraged to begin this 2023-24 academic year. We're very excited to have Todd Shy with us this morning to help center our thoughts before we start to get into the housekeeping measures and the nitty and the gritty and the syllabi and all of this. Let's take a moment this morning to remember why we are called to do what we do and to remember as the students that we serve. Poignantly, I will share with you quickly that in our various staff openings at King, I've seen an increase of teachers actually in the field applying for jobs that they could be very successful here. And then I'm faced with the ethical question, do I want to be the person that pulls them out of the classroom? And so teachers are facing a lot today. You hear it in the media. And so Todd is going to speak to us as a former colleague of ours told us, Gloria Oster, she posted, she's coming to the lecture later in the evening, but she said, Thoreau and education, I'm in. So I'm not going to give you a quote of Thoreau. I wanted to give you a quote from Emerson. And when you hear this quote and you hear what I think what we'll hear this morning, you may say, well, that's of two minds. Well, bear with me for a moment. Finish every day and be done with it. You have done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities no doubt crept in. Forget them as fast as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. You shall begin it well and serenely, and with too high a spirit to be cumbered with your old nonsense. So on one hand, we hold this ability to have a memory like a goldfish, to remember that we get up and each day is a new day. But I think one of the reasons that caused us to be such a strong faculty at King is this ability to be a reflective teacher. And to have this ability to say that I can do better and that we're not self-satisfied in our teaching, but that we want to continue to be better in our craft to enhance our student experience. So with that in mind, let's remember why we're here this morning. Martin, will you come and introduce Todd?
It's nice to be back in the chapel again, in spite of summer being too short. I'm glad to have you all here this morning, and I'm delighted to welcome Todd Shy. Todd has been to King twice before, although he is a long-term native of Bristol. He grew up here and went to Virginia High, and after Virginia High, went to the University of Virginia. Following that, he went and spent 4 years, I think that's right, as a research assistant for John Stott, a preacher in London some of you may be aware of. Following that, he came back and went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and then began a career in teaching, which has gone from North Carolina up to Manhattan, out to San Francisco briefly, and now back in Manhattan, where he works for Avenues, the World School as the head of the upper division. He's taught and been an administrator both, and in those roles he has both been in the trenches as a teacher and been in the role of encouraging and helping teachers do their job best. This past year, he published a book called Teaching Life, and it seemed like a great moment to get him back to King, especially for this event. We all come in at the end of a summer, I think, ready to get back in the saddle a bit. There's always an invariable excitement at the beginning of a school year, and yet it's also a burden, and I think the stories in this book are useful for us, and I'm delighted to have Todd back to give us a bit of encouragement and a bit of a push as we head into a new academic year. He's been to King twice, in 2013 and in 2017. When I realized we were getting him for this, I also thought, I'm going to make him do something else. So he is going to speak in the evening tonight, and I would love to have you there if possible. We're going to be on campus. We'll be in the boardroom of the Student Center complex at 7 p.m., and that's where Todd will present for the first time the work he's been doing on Henry David Thoreau and education, which is already a manuscript form. So if you can join us tonight at 7 o'clock, please do. Anyway, otherwise, please join me in welcoming Todd Schei.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Matt. Matt, I have that very Emerson quote is printed out in my office. I look at it when I leave every day. That's why I was smiling when you were quoting it. I'm a big fan of Emerson and Thoreau. If you do come tonight, you'll see I got wrapped up in Thoreau during the pandemic, where I was not leaving my apartment except to go to school and to go to the grocery store quickly with a mask and get in and get out. And then otherwise I was in my apartment by myself for what felt like a long, long time during the pandemic, and I just started reading Thoreau again. If you come tonight, I'll tell you why. And then I stayed immersed in Thoreau ever since, and hope to leave him alone soon. I feel like 3 years is probably enough to be immersed in any one writer. It's a privilege to be with you all today. I love Bristol and I love King. Anytime Martin, this is the third time, as soon as Martin reaches out to me and says, "Will you go?" The answer is immediately a yes. Let's see if we can work out the details. I've been away for, my adult life, but this is home. And when I come back, I, emotionally, spiritually, biographically attached to this place. We moved here when I was in third grade, so I went through the school system. I started at Highland View Elementary, if you know where that school is, and then Van Pelt Elementary on the Virginia side, which is undergoing significant expansion now as they're consolidating the elementary schools onto that hill. That's where I went to school. I went to what at the time was Virginia Junior High School, now the middle school. In those days, it was just grades 7 and 8. And then Virginia High School. Anybody in here go to Virginia? Yeah. All right. I graduated in 1984. 81? Okay. When did you graduate? Okay. Well, fellow Bearcats. When I played on the basketball team when I was there. We had a really good team. And I also edited the school newspaper. And part of my task as editor of the paper was selling ads. And if memory serves, I don't have this written down anywhere. My memory is our goal was to sell $1,300 or $1,400 worth of ads, and that would meet our budget for the year. And I drove over here the summer before my senior year, which is 40 years ago exactly. I would be starting my senior year of high school 40 years ago this month. And sometime either in July or August, 40 years ago, I drove over here to see if you all would buy an ad from me to put in our school newspaper. And I can't remember the building, but I'm pretty sure it was the admissions office. Is there anybody in the admissions office here? I feel like it would have been the admissions office as I drove around the campus. But King bought a nice, good-size ad. I think it was about $80 or $90 to run multiple times in the year. And I'd lost all my old copies of my high school newspaper. But last fall, my uncle passed away, and my uncle and I were pretty close, and I was helping his son clean out all of his stuff. And in his closet, I found a box of photos and mementos. He was a track athlete and track medals. And, but he had one copy of one issue of my high school newspaper, which I have here, the Virginian Times. And this is the only one I have. And I brought it because it's got the ad that I sold to King in here. It also has on the cover, so this is the paper, it's a little hard to see, but here's my article titled Speeches Axed for the Student Council Elections. And then on the inside, because I was the editor, I had a column. I'll just show you the spread here. This is, my column says, computers bewilder, future is baffling. That was 1984. So I don't know what 18-year-old Todd would have to say, or what 57-year-old Todd would have to say to 18-year-old Todd about computers. But here's the ad. King, I don't know if you can see it. It's down here at the bottom, the second largest ad in our newspaper, happily running and happily connecting me as a high school student to this place. So I'm glad to keep that going in these last 9 years, I think. We first Dale Brown, and then Martin and I have stayed in touch. So all happy memories. I'm happy to be back. Matt, Martin, thank you for inviting me and welcoming me. For the already warm Southern hospitality, which I miss up in a city not very famous for its warmth and hospitality. I do love New York, but it's a tough place to live, and I'm glad to be back receiving this sort of warmth and welcome. I am going to invite us this morning, as Matt's already teed this up, to think and talk about being teachers. And very deliberately, I'm not saying that we're going to think about teaching and learning, but which in the school circles where I am, like that's where the focus usually is, teaching and learning. And that's important and that's great. So no shade from me on that. But we don't balance that with talking about what it is to be a teacher, the being of a teacher. And I think that's one of the reasons why, Matt's, your story is poignant and representative, because a lot of people are leaving teaching. I mean, before the pandemic, the statistics were, so school teachers, primary, secondary school teachers, about 1 in 3 didn't make it to their 5th year of teaching. People left the profession early. And then during the pandemic, I mean, the skyrocketing statistics of people leaving classrooms, because it was already undervalued, and the work is really, really hard. And then all the added pressures of being under the pandemic just drove people. The statistics were, the National Education Association did a broad survey. It was 2021, so when the pandemic was still at its height. And more than 50% of teachers were considering retiring earlier than they had planned and moving on and changing location. So I'm not surprised to hear that people are looking for other things. It's really hard. And I think part of it, so there are lots of things that probably need to be done to help improve that. The little lane that I've gotten myself in is to try to talk about what it is to inhabit this role, what it is to be a teacher. And so I wrote this little book about that, and I'm trying to angle the work I'm doing on Thoreau in that direction too. And I call this session with you all this morning the romance of teaching, because I think there's something life-giving and inspirational and transformative about being a teacher, but it doesn't often get elevated. And I think we need it, now more than ever. And at the beginning of the year, Martin and I met up yesterday. We were talking about the beginnings of school years being kind of energizing and exciting. Like this is the best time of the year to be a teacher, when we're regathering and getting ready for a new school year. And I have felt over the years, I'm going into my 28th year working in schools. The school year feels like a liturgical year. Like and every year it starts over again. It's always a fresh beginning to a school year, and there's something really nourishing just about being inside of that framework. And the weird thing is, we repeat that sort of liturgical feel to the year. We keep getting older, and the students in front of us show up the exact same age. So it's like we're teaching the same kind of students, and we keep getting older. And that's a strangeness to me about being a teacher, and a kind of a lovely part of it. But the power of a new beginning of a new school year, I'm looking forward to next week welcoming my faculty back, and then we have almost 2,000 students in my New York school, and then welcoming them back and launching the year. I think the beginning of year to Thanksgiving is probably the richest amount of learning that happens in school at my level anyway. But I want to recognize, because I've talked about this topic when my book came out, and it interviewed a few places where people said, yeah, but aren't you being a little too rosy about what being a teacher is, or romantic about what being a teacher is, with all the hard stuff. And it's like, well, that's what I'm trying to balance or correct. But I think it's worth acknowledging the challenges, and then talk about what it is nonetheless to be a teacher. I just don't think there's enough life and lift and kind of lyricism about what it is to be a teacher. I think Thoreau does have a line about singing, and it's like singing the world, and the world needs to be sung as well as just interacted with and described. And I think teaching, we need to sing what teaching is too. So I hope maybe to do that a little bit with you today through the power of stories. I know we have a couple of hours together, so I hope everybody can just relax into this space and mode. I want to give you a chance to talk with each other a little bit too, and we'll do the best we can maybe to have a little bit of back and forth. Although the setting elevates the sense that teaching I think is a near sacred endeavor. We'll make it a little bit harder maybe to have easy conversations, but we'll try. And so I'll share a lot of stories with you. We will take a break. I hope we have a chance to do a little bit of Q&A and back and forth, and we'll wrap with a couple of final teacher stories. So before we head down that path together, I would like to start with a simple warm-up that lets you talk with each other. I've used this prompt at presentations in Central America and East Asia, where I was this spring, as well as in the States. And the answers, even in those different contexts, are pretty consistent. We'll see if yours are different or similar. And the question is this: how long does it take to become a good teacher? And by good, let's just say kind of confident, competent, by your own lights, a good teacher. And maybe the judgment of whoever's supervising you too, that they consider that good teaching. But I'm interested in this question, so I always like to ask when I'm with new folks, how long does it take to become a good teacher? And I'm going to invite you just to find a neighbor and talk and see what you all decide. 2 or 3 of you, whatever's comfortable. Go ahead and answer the question. How long does it take to become a good teacher? You all dive right in and find each other. Sometimes people try to hide when you're asked to participate in these, so thank you for not trying to do that. Would anybody like to use big professorial voices to share what in your group you decided? Oh, you do? Great. We can pass them around? Are they detachable? Okay. Martin, could we maybe get a mic and just pass it around to... I would love to hear, and I'll tell you what people in other cultures and contexts have said, but let's hear yours. How long does it take to become good, confident, competent? You're not dreading and sweating going into a room full of students that you have to teach.
So several of us in the School of Nursing decided that we would look at Patricia Benner's model, novice to expert, and we decided that we might be competent around that 5 to 10 year mark, but we all decided we would never consider ourselves good.
Okay. Who else? I'm going to cold call my Virginia High friends if nobody else comes. So you all get ready if we other people decide.
Well, this row is School of Ed, and we've seen some absolutely remarkable student teachers. So we still feel like there's some zeros in there that's kick it off the first day almost. But then we thought, no, our own standard is never reached. Will not be good until we work a really long time.
What do you see in those young teachers that makes you say, like, what's the thing that you identify as they're on their way?
Self-efficacy and a relationship with the students.
Okay. Yeah, well, those young teachers who aren't afraid of the kid, it's young people are intimidating. A room full of young people is intimidating, and those teachers who aren't afraid of that and go right in, like they're right on their way. I agree. Building relationships. Others, we have a 5 to 10. We have 0 but. What do others think?
Thank you. Our conversation led us to think that maybe a lifetime was appropriate.
Can you say one thing about that? Like, why is that?
It's ever evolving. It's something that while you might meet your goals in year 5 or year 10, there's always something more that you're trying to achieve that you're not going to get to. And then I think after a lifetime, maybe you can look back and say, well, I did get to those milestones.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that there was one outlier in our group, but we came to the consensus that it might take a little bit longer to feel comfortable, like competent in terms of how you're interacting with students than it does to master the substance of what it is that you're teaching. So you might master the substance maybe in 3 or 4 years, but you may not feel truly comfortable in how you're presenting it and how you're interacting with your classes until maybe 7 or 8 years. And that at any one time, there can be a semester that just comes in there, and because of student dynamics or some kind of, institutional trauma, you're just thrown for a loop and you have to start all over again, rebuilding that confidence.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what we already said, and your point about the importance of relationships, you get new kids every year. So in some ways, you're starting over again, because what matters in teaching is not abstract teaching, it's teaching these students who are in front of me. And if they're new every year, in some way you're new again every year. So that it's like the challenge refreshes as well as the beauty of that. Anybody else? Yes.
Kind of summarizing from our group, we felt like 3 years is a certain milestone of competence and quality. And also that someone said if you need to teach good students and awful students before you really know what you're doing. And then also teaching core curriculum will make you a better teacher.
Yeah, interesting. So 3 gets you to a competent level. Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in? Martin, what do you think? How many years?
Get back to me in about 10 years.
Okay. So I supervise a lot of teachers, and my responsibility is middle school and high school, so grades 6 through 12. I supervise my, let's see, how many faculty this year? 120 faculty. And my anxiety goes down at year 3. If a teacher's new or in their second year, I check in with my team constantly on how often they're in there, how's that teacher doing. At year 3, that starts to loosen. But every place I've ever asked this question, and I think my own judgment's right around there too, is year 5 always comes up as, like, it's about then that you start to develop enough tools in your toolkit, your mindset, your competence, you need to know all the stuff you teach really well, and then you have to know how to manage young people who right now are, really, particularly right now, are very stressed and I think needy of adults to guide them and coach them. But I think that's relevant because, so at my level, in primary and secondary schools, that year 5, when you're going to become good, there's huge attrition before you get there. And so the teaching profession is stressed because of that, because then you're bringing in new teachers all the time who have a really long, I think, a long apprenticeship because the work is that hard. And then on top of that, so this is more true for my realm than yours, but I think it's worth naming. Teachers are just really undervalued. And so Frank McCourt, who the author who wrote Angela's Ashes, 20, 30 years ago or whatever, and made himself a fortune, his memoir about growing up in Ireland, was a teacher for about 30 years in New York City. And he described teaching as the downstairs maid of the professions. I've started calling it the safety school of the professions. You know, when our students apply to colleges, the most stressful part of the work that I do is, sending them off to the level at which you all are. They all have safety schools. They think, here's where I want to go. Here's where I think I can get in. Here's where I know I can get in. And they call those safety schools. And I think teaching is that for people. They're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I want to go study this. I'm going to go to grad school. And then if, nothing, then I can teach. There's a little bit of that mindset. And so a job that's already really hard is also really undervalued and not seen as something that's really elevated. And that's why I'm on this mission to elevate it, to lift what it is that we do and make it something that people aspire to. There are all kinds of new challenges. I want to do one more turn and talk on this because I want to hear from you all about the things, if teaching itself is a hard job, for I think the reasons you rightly identified is that you're building relationships with students and waves of new students every year. And you're also have to be expert in the stuff you're teaching. And you're also managing all the things that Matt's going to ask you to do from an organizational, institutional needs. And you're doing all of that. So that's just table stakes, what makes our work hard. There's a lot of recent things that in the last few years, not just the actual pandemic, but things that are making school hard at every level. And this is what we do share, I think, from primary, secondary, and then into a college level. There are new pressures and new things that are going on. And I just want you to take a minute and turn and talk. What are some recent things that are hard about the work that we do? And then having set up the challenges and the hardness, I'm going to turn and say there's this romance and beauty to what we do in the context of that. So a quick turn and talk. You're just back from summers. You probably just want to talk to each other anyway. But what makes it so hard, recently, what are the things that are putting pressure on us? Teaching particularly hard at your all's level now. And Martin, if you don't mind going around with the mic. Just hand it off. Sure, he put somebody on the spot. Would anybody like to? Okay. Let's hang on one second. Let's just let people finish their conversations and come back. This is fun. I feel like I'm teaching a class now, and this is, it's what you're doing. And all that's just good energy. I'm pleased when that's happening in a classroom with teenagers who, if I can get them off their phones, is the triumph. Please, yes.
One of the things that we talked about was the fact that it feels like that education has become transactional in some senses, that the students say, I check these boxes, so I get this grade, and our transaction is done, versus conversation and learning and that sort of robust relationship.
So interesting, yeah. What else?
I'm a librarian, and we talked about censorship and political polarization and a lot of outside influences wanting to look at what you're teaching your students and
Yeah.
have a say in
Yeah.
it.
People are very interested in what's happening in schools now. Yep.
Very recent Gallup poll asking Americans how much they value higher education showed that we are at the lowest in that confidence in the history of our country, and both sides of the political aisle showing their lack of confidence in what we do. And so we are all here because we value higher education, but finding ourselves having to prove why we value that.
Yeah, I think that one is huge. And that's new, I think, right? But people went, yeah, pre-pandemic, but not much. I mean, when I was growing up, I've already revealed my age, but I mean, everybody, it's like you aspire, you go to college, and that's how you get on to the next, everybody. But you're right, Peter Thiel, he made a fortune in Silicon Valley and funds a lot of tech ventures, a tech billionaire. One of the things he did, he pays people, they could apply for a fellowship to skip college and just go become kind of entrepreneurial or whatever. Like, he's paying them to do that. And that is sad to me because the missing the richness of what a college experience is. But I agree with you. Yeah. What else?
This is more aerobic than I planned on.
Well, from those of us who still see the public school system almost daily, we would say that the state mandates, many of those are impacting us greatly, and including what we can and cannot deliver to students and as well as pre-service teachers. What we call ACEs or trauma certainly makes it difficult.
Yeah.
Leadership, we talk about how that you look at the number of students that some districts have to try to move in the same direction successfully, and there's 2,000 students and one principal.
Yeah.
So you think about just the archaic setup of that compared to what we have today to face. So leadership, and then just that historical model not being able to change with the demographics that we do serve.
Yeah, boy, the pandemic burnt out principals at a really risky rate. Like to find good people who are willing to do that job is harder and harder too. What else? Nobody's done AI. If somebody got artificial intelligence on your mind, for sure that's got to be something that's on somebody's mind.
I caught my first one this summer.
You did?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say we all gonna need a strategy.
Well, I'm going to have some pretty great syllabi
Matt,
this fall.
you
I
good?
know that.
Martin was the one that told me that all the faculty moral outrage dissipates after they learn they can use it to write recommendation letters. But from an administrator point of view, a recent change that I have seen, and we'll have workshops on AI and ChatGPT, but also difficult stakeholders. There's a cartoon I saw recently. In the first panel, it was the parent with the child, with the teacher 30 years ago, and the parent was scolding the child, what did you do to the teacher to make them angry? And today, the reverse is true. I was trying to give a phrase to this when talking with Martin, but there's just no professional deference anymore to the profession of teaching.
Yeah.
And so parents will come in with both guns blazing, not just wanting to have access, what you're familiar with FERPA, like educational records, but once they are granted that access, they believe they can act as proxy and then begin to examine and question and interrogate the methodology of the instructor and basically the whole professional construct of teaching. So that is a fairly recent, I can't pinpoint when it happened, but we're dealing with more and more issues like that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, sure, parents don't contact you all? Okay, I'm sorry. It just doesn't help their kid. I mean, they're trying to help their kid, so we can empathize with the anxiety, but it's not the helpful for it. Yeah. You can imagine my role. I mean, the amount of time I spend with parents, the supercharged anxiety in New York City at a private school is like half of my job. Is like managing that. but to try to keep them away from teachers. So you got to keep them away from Anybody else on challenges? Yeah, the polarization. Yeah, the students, that's a great point. Thank you for adding that. I was reading something recently, and I've observed this, that students are becoming gun shy about sharing their points of view in back and forth in class because they're not sure of sort of the rules of what's acceptable, what they can and can't say, and so they're not engaging in the way that we want, or it's going in that like heavy, strong, polarized way. Yeah, that's really hard. That's really hard. I mean, part of me wants to say school, and particularly college life, should be this, monastery, studying deep, important, lasting things, and not just being a version of everything that's going on outside of it, but that's not realistic. Well, thank you for sharing those. I agree with all of that, and none of us mentioned the pandemic, and so you dropped that onto all of that, where we're really worried about our kids. And we graduated students last year who did all of high school experiencing the pandemic in some form, and you all are receiving kids whose high school and middle school lives were so disrupted that you're going to see that and have to adjust to that too. Well, those are all the challenges. For years, when I would tell people I was a teacher, to kind of sum up on this challenge side, I would tell people I was a teacher, and I taught middle school for a long time. And boy, if you tell them you teach middle school, it's doubly this. But I would say I'm a teacher, and people would kind of step away. It's like, boy, I could never do that. People say, I could never do that. You tell them you teach middle school, and then you're into thank you for your service territory. I mean, honestly. And so I've experienced that over and over and over. Boy, I don't know how you do that. I could never do that. And I think they're just afraid of like young adolescents, and understandably. But over the years, so there's a kind of a discouraging thing as a teacher. And over the years, it occurred to me at some point to start changing the conversation, and I started asking a different question. And so you talk about education, it's enormously stressed, and we're always stressed about our performance and how our kids are doing, and they're not doing well enough, and they're all the things that you mentioned. And nobody wants to become a teacher, and that's unfair. It's an undervalued profession, and so people who go into it see themselves as like doing something noble without being valued. A lot of people leaving the profession. But I started asking people different questions. I would just say, tell me about an important teacher that you had. Just tell me about it. Who was your best teacher? Who was your formative teacher? And the people who were doing this, like they're leaning forward. Say, oh, yeah, well, Miss Acuff is Miss Acuff. And the tone, I mean, people who had teachers who had an impact on me, it's reverent. I will have I shouldn't talk about Miss Acuff because I will get intensely emotional. She taught me 3 miles. How far away is Virginia High? 3 miles that way. My 11th grade English teacher. And she passed away before I finished. I wanted to deliver this book to her on velvet. But you ask people, tell me about it, and people tell these stories. So I started asking myself, it's like, wait, so many people have that, like their lives were changed by teachers. And we talk about teaching this way, like the profession, but then we talk about teachers this way. So I'm like, all right, well, let's start talking about teachers then, and less about the frameworks and the challenges. Let's talk and celebrate what teachers do. And I kind of went on a quest to do that, and began gathering teacher stories. Some of my own and some wherever I could find them in reading and in conversation. And I've started having, just to share, one of the things we've done, and I think this applies at any level, when my faculty comes back next week, the week after that, We'll have 7 days together before students arrive, and we will tell stories on each of those days as part of our gathering in the morning. We tell teacher stories, and sometimes I'll give them a prompt. Last year we had a little series of we invited people to tell stories about teachers who had an impact on them outside of a classroom, teachers who had an impact on them in an area that wasn't their subject of interest or whatever. We just gave them a bunch of prompts, and people get up and tell teacher stories. And that room full of, so my faculty is, big and smart and sometimes unwieldy, and to get them all in one place and do things together is its own energetic challenge. But when people are telling teacher stories, it's pin drop time, and they're listening to each other. And in my mind, it's elevating what we do by reminding ourselves of those. So I'd like to tell you some teacher stories this morning, if that's okay, to do the same, in the space, in our minds, but also collectively to sort of lift that. One quick, more sort of academic reference first, and then just great stories. But John Dewey wrote an essay 100 years ago, a little over 100 because it's still worth reading, called The Child and the Curriculum. So Dewey, was a philosophy professor who started, I can't believe he's the only one who's done this way. He was studying philosophy and said, well, the way to figure out philosophical questions is to watch kids and school, focus on education, what happens with kids. So he wrote an essay called The Child and the Curriculum. And he uses an image that's really important to me, and I drive this with my own faculty too, the images of maps and journeys. And Dewey says, maps are really useful because they make our journeys more efficient, and that's great. But maps are not the journey, right? They're helping you with the journey. And what he saw, and that sort of progressive education corrected, was that the tendency of school was map world. It was studying maps and obsessing over maps. And Dewey's like, yeah, you need that, and that's curriculum. You need that. It should be really good. And if it's not, you've got to drop other things and get that good. But it's not the journey of education. And what the maps serve the journey. And I think he saw, and I think we still are, we're just lopsided in obsessing over the things that fit in the realm of maps, measurement, and all those things that are important. But the journey with kid after kid after kid, with student after student after student, what's their experience in your classroom and in other people's classrooms? What are they encountering, and what's registering with them, and what's changing their trajectory, and what's building the story they're going to tell about themselves? That's their journey, and the maps need to serve that. So The Child and the Curriculum. It's still a really great essay to read. Okay. Well, let's do some teacher stories. And I thought, if it's okay, I'll start with an actor, Patrick Stewart. Patrick Stewart, he's Captain Picard, or in the second Star Trek series. He's a Shakespearean actor, he's British, and a well-known Sir Patrick Stewart. And not long ago, I think it's maybe a year and a half ago now, I read something he wrote in a British newspaper, The Guardian, because his formative teacher passed away. And he wrote about him, Cecil Dormand. And that teacher introduced him, he said, as a 12-year-old to Shakespeare. This became a great Shakespearean actor. And it was the juncture in his life. And he describes being at a point at the age of 11 or 12, if he's got two paths he can go down. He can go down this path, and he has to take the exams to go down that, or he can go down this path. And he ends up going down this path. And that's where he met this teacher. So I'm just going to read what he said about the teacher he met on this path. Patrick Stewart. Had I sat that test for this path, I might never have met Cecil Dormand over here, a teacher at the secondary modern where I ended up, who would change my life when I was 12 by putting Shakespeare into my hands for the first time. It was The Merchant of Venice, 12 years old. He gave copies to most of us and told us to look up Act 4, Scene 1, the famous trial scene, as I was to learn. And the first words, I have possessed your grace of what I purpose was the first line of Shakespeare I ever read. I barely understood a word, but I loved the feel of the words and the sounds in my mouth. A 400-year-old writer reached out a hand in invitation to me that morning. I felt a sense of an internal private me being released and connecting with something mysterious, alien, and exciting. Let me read that again. I felt a sense of an internal private me being released and connecting with something mysterious, alien, and exciting, and I was hooked. And Cease passed away a few weeks ago at the age of 96. He saved me when I was a boy, and my education was failing, and has without doubt been the most significant person in my life as a teacher. If I had not met Cease, what would have happened to me? I am so grateful for his belief in me. Rest in peace, sir. It's an extraordinary tribute. How many years after this teacher's 96 years old, Patrick Stewart hears about it and summons all of this feeling and tribute, reverence for teaching. I mean, who else has that job that gets to do that? And so obviously, every time I probably read that 15 or 20 times publicly, and I'm moved by the account. But I also pay really close attention, not just to the beauty of the gratitude, which is immense, but to what Stewart says his teacher did to set up this life-changing encounter. And it's really simple, and it's easy to not do. But it's that line, I felt a sense of an internal private me being released, but not just released, because it's not all just inside the student waiting for you to figure out how to release it. It's connecting to something else that they didn't know was there. He didn't know Shakespeare. And the teacher, but you don't just hold Shakespeare up and the kids have to get there. Like it's the connecting work. Like he connected to Patrick Stewart enough to get him to wake up to the thing that he didn't know about, that the teacher knew about, and pulled him to that. And so I mean, that's magnificent to me. Why aren't we unpacking things like that when we're thinking about teaching and designing our courses and designing our curriculum and designing our priorities and all of that? Like, where does that fit in, that role of the teacher? Because Patrick Stewart tells us it was not just important, it was like the pivotal saving moment of his life. So I want to think about what people tell about their teachers, but then also figure out how do we be intentional about building environments that do that. All right, here's another teacher story. I'm going to give you a bunch of teacher stories. We don't do this enough. This one's from Albert Camus. I've been criticized. I've shared a bunch of teacher stories before. They're like, you have a lot of writers. I'm like, sorry, that's who I read. So you get a lot of writers. There are no doubt stories like this in all fields. But this is Albert Camus, the writer. Camus had just been awarded the Nobel Prize. His first thought, he said, was of his mother. Camus had a tough childhood. His father died. So he was born in Algeria, when it was a French colony. And his father died in an early World War I battle before Camus was old enough to know him. So he never knew his father. His mother raised him in poverty. And so his gratitude first went to his mother. But the second person he thought of was a teacher. It was a Nobel Prize. The announcement of the Nobel Prize arrives. And he thinks of a teacher. He's at the absolute pinnacle of professional accomplishment and respect. There is no award a writer can win more prestigious, and his mind goes back to a teacher who paid attention to him and valued him, and then did the same thing with Patrick Stewart, connected him out to other things when he was way too small to know what a Nobel Prize even was, and he took pen and paper and wrote his teacher a letter. So here's his letter, having won this award. Dear Monsieur Germain, I let the commotion around me these days subside a bit before speaking to you from the bottom of my heart. I've just been given far too great an honor, and one I neither sought nor solicited. But when I heard the news, my first thought after my mother was of you. Without you, without the affectionate hand you extended to the small, poor child that I was, without your teaching and example, none of all of this would have happened. I don't make too much of this sort of honor, the Nobel Prize level honor, but it gives me the opportunity to tell you what you have been and still are for me, and to assure you that your efforts, your work, and the generous hearts you put into it still live in one of your little schoolboys who, despite the years, has never stopped being your grateful pupil. I embrace you with all my heart, Albert Camus. Who else gets to do this? But the sense that people tell over and over, and I've gathered a lot of stories, it's there, it's of being seen and being recognized, and then pushed towards something that they didn't know was there. And there's something quiet inside them, and every kid, whether they're pre-adolescent, adolescent, or as you're getting them right on the cusp of going out into the world, that needs to be recognized, stirred, claimed, and given life. And great teachers are doing that at every level. They see kids. They relentlessly pay attention to the students in front of them. I also think they find young people really interesting. They're fascinated by them, and they're not bored or scared of them. Patrick Stewart said, "I'm so grateful for Cease's belief in me." Teachers believe in kids. Camus' language was generosity. And I insist with I have a team of, I'm a division head, and I have a team of associate division heads, and I just insist that they are paying attention to this when they're coaching teachers and supervising teachers. How are they doing connecting to kids? How are they doing believing in kids? Are we doing that? Because, do we care about what people tell us made the difference in their school life and in their life? And you see this, the seeing, the claiming, it's loving. And it's everywhere in people's stories about formative teachers. It's just not everywhere in books about teaching. And that's what I think we need to correct. At the other end of the spectrum, your end, the novelist Philip Roth said of his most important college professor, "She valued me. This is what I needed and what I got. Look, somebody has to tell you that you're smart and that you're doing the right thing. She valued me. That's what I needed, and that's what I got from her." And he was in touch with her his whole adult life as a successful writer. I had teachers like this in my own journey. Because I'm in Bristol, I'll tell you about my Bristol teacher, Miss Abel, in 4th grade. If you're interested, my book has a whole chapter about Miss Acuff, who is my iconic teacher figure. But it's in 4th grade. At the beginning of the year, Miss Abel called my mother, as my mother told me later, and said, "Hey, I've been watching your son, and he's reading." She was my reading teacher. "He's reading at a high level. I'm really not worried about his progress in that at all, but I'm worried about the way he is with other students," which was, I take being judgmental, quickly critical, probably unkind. And Miss Abel said, that's going to hold him back. And so I'm going to figure out how to work on that with him this year. And I wanted you to know it, to my mother. It's an extraordinary act. She didn't, what the standard teacher move is, that becomes a note on a report card, But she built a vision and strategy for it and told my mother, "This is what I'm going to do. And it's going to take time, and it's going to require patience." And she named something about my little 10-year-old self. And she improvised an extraordinary personal curriculum for me. She wanted me to be a better person. And she did it beautifully, and I had no idea at the time what she was doing, no, intentionally. And she has no idea, as a teacher who taught hundreds and hundreds of kids, that I have shared this story about her with audience after audience after audience. What I knew was that she was interested in me, and she was invested in me. Every student knows that if you're invested in them. They know it. And if you're not, they know that too. And you can't figure out what the thing is to do with every student. And that's why there are teams of us. There's full faculties of us. Somebody can. But they'll know if you're invested in them or not. And she was with me. And the way I describe it is that she claimed me. She refused to let me not be successful. Here's a teacher story. Is it okay to tell you a couple more teacher stories? You all right? Okay. This is not a famous person, just from a colleague that I encountered at lunch one day. I sat down next to him and did what you do. Hey, what's going on? How are you doing? What's going on? He said, not much. I just got an email from an old student who's in Mongolia teaching in the Peace Corps. I said, well, that's interesting. Why was he writing you? And he said, he said I was the reason he was there. And I said, okay, what's the story? What did you do? And my colleague said, I couldn't figure that kid out for the longest time. And I watched him. And I kept watching him. And finally, it occurred to me what he was about. And I held him back after class. And I said, hey, and I can't remember the details of it. It's been too long. He said, but because you're this thing, you should think about this other thing. And that kid took it and ran with it, and then wrote my friend from Mongolia about how that led to the path that he was on. And in that story, I just love the watching. Because you don't instantly figure your students out. It's not a magic trick. And he just kept, he's like, this kid, what is it with this kid? It's interesting. And I can't figure it out. He just kept watching and watching and watching. And then he did the thing that I'm convinced is the secret, the superpower of being a teacher at any level is not announcing to the class, hey, there's this great opportunity you all should think about, or here's a book I recommend to everyone, but to pull a kid back after class and connect with them and say, because you're this thing, you should think about reading this book, or you should think about doing this other thing. And what that does for a student who feels claimed that way, so Miss Acuff did that with me. She was my 11th grade English teacher, and she was not charismatic, and she did not fill a room. She was quiet. She sat on a stool most of the class in the front of the room, sweater over her shoulders, kind of monotone voice. She was just not dynamic, but she was paying attention to me. And how do I know that? Because in that winter, she held me back after class and said, hey, and she pulled a book off her shelf. It was not this book. She pulled a book off her shelf, and she handed it to me. She said, I think you'll like this book. I think you, Todd, will like this book. And I mean, when somebody does that you value, I had a away basketball game that day. And I remember, I can see it. I was sitting on the bus in the cold on a winter ride up to Graham. Is Graham still up there? Graham High School? Does anybody know? Up in the coal mines. We played Graham. And I was reading this book all the way up until the light disappeared. I remember holding the book up because the light was going away, just to catch the last light I could to keep reading it. Because in her mind, this book had something to do with me, and it pulled me to it. It's just an amazing and simple thing. You could do that all the time because you know more than they do. And if you're paying attention to them, you can pull them along. I think it's the superpower of the teacher. I think you will like this book. I was talking to a colleague about this idea in the spring, and he said, oh yeah, you start talking to people about their teachers. He said, oh yeah, I got an email not long ago from a former student. He said, I taught him in 2006, and he's a teacher now. And he sent me a copy of a comment that I wrote about him in high school And he said, how did you do this? So how do you write a comment that lands and has an impact like this? 17 years ago. And this young teacher still has this comment. And, I asked my colleague about it. My colleague's an extraordinary teacher. And he said, that student had real anger issues and he couldn't control himself. And when he was in that frustrated mode, he said, I'd try to go where he was. Just to see if I could learn what to do with that student. And it's that paying attention that led to that comment. The power of paying attention to kids and the investment in that. 17 years on, the impact. What extraordinary work teaching is. It's so quiet. And we're planting these seeds, and they'll grow. Poor Miss Abel, who did all that work with me, and she doesn't know what I am or who I am, but she helped. She was a fork in the road for me. Miss Acuff too. Miss Acuff did come to one of our King events because I made sure she was there. I couldn't feel more highly about her. Let me do one. Which one? I wanted to do one more story, and then maybe I think we'll take a little break. Let's do this one. This is the writer Sam Lipsyte. And he describes the passion of his English teacher rubbing off on him and igniting him. This teacher loved literature, jazz, and movies, and he also didn't let his students get away with things. And Sam Lipsyte says, one day in class, he tried a bold and really boastful interpretation of a poem. And he said I was showing off more than anything. He's a 17-year-old kid. And his classmates laughed. And here's his account of what followed. So I'm quoting. My teacher had a big grin on his face. I waited for the rescue to see exactly how he would praise my brilliance in front of my occasional tormentors. No, said Mr. Wright. No, Lipsyte says. Deep down, I'd known it was a silly theory, but I figured I could will it to profundity, a sort of intellectual, magical thinking. The clarity of Mr. Wright helped banish no, he said again. But I'm very glad you thought of it. It's a very exciting interpretation. And this quieted the class down. We all respected his enthusiasm. It is, Lipsyte says, absolutely. And we have to try everything as we think these things through. If I felt a little humiliated by exposing a bit of my freak core, the shame was ameliorated by Mr. Wright's final comment. We have to try everything as we think these things through. What an unexpected and gorgeous thing to say. And Sam Lipsyte goes on, not only had he not crushed my spirit, he hadn't even crushed my nonsense, which I could now view as a necessary, nay, salient and fortuitous stage on the journey to knowledge. He'd shot down my idea because it was stupid and half-baked. But don't do that too bluntly with your students. But as far as his support for the greater project, namely me learning that the sometimes confusing but often exquisite fizz I felt in the vicinity of poetry and prose was just who I was, and something to cultivate rather than to hide. He'd given me everything I needed. As a person, as an artist, as a teacher, I've never forgotten it. He'd given me everything I needed just by validating him. I've never forgotten it. Who else gets to do this? When I used to tell people I was a teacher, and they would say, the hands up in the back, in a way, I could never do that. How do you do that? What they should really be asking us is, what is it like to get to do that? What is that like? Because on the inside, we experience it as, we have bad days, we have slogs. It's a marathon, not a sprint, all of that. Miss Abel's work with me is day by day, patient act by patient act. But on the inside, we know that the wonder of that, and that's what people should ask, and that's why we should tell these stories about teachers. I have a couple more, but I feel like we should maybe take a break. Thank you for that clock staring me at the in the face. I feel like we should take a break. Any guidance on the break, Martin or Matt? Take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back, and then I'll ask you some of your thoughts too, and tell you a couple more stories. 10:20 is when we shall return. You can tell I was a middle school teacher for a long time. Let's start to regather and resettle. Martin.
Because I'm kind of a heavy and a major authoritarian figure, Todd asked me to try to reconvene you. Scoundrels. Thanks. I see that, Joe Strickland. I forgot two things which I was supposed to say when I did the introduction earlier, and I'll mention them now. One is that since Todd first came in 2013, I've been able to go see him a couple times in Manhattan. So if you happen to be in Manhattan and you want to go get a good meal, go meet him there. And one of the things that this has produced for me is great recommendations of things to read. From Todd, I got the recommendation to read Saul Bellows' novel Herzog. I got the recommendation to read the Dutch novelist Cees Notenboom, a novel called Rituals. Last night I got the recommendation to read Tish Harrison Warren's farewell column in the New York Times. What I'm saying is, if you want to sound really smart, ask him what to read. And it sounds great. Dutch names, things like that. But that has been a rich part of my friendship with Todd over the years. Also, I'm happy to say we have about 40 of these to give away, but you got to earn it a little bit. So if you want to have a copy of Teaching Life, you can come tonight, and we'll have a number of them on hand. And if you come tonight, you can not only get the book, you can get Todd to sign it. It's an efficient signature, 7 letters. It's really short for somebody who has 17 letters in his name. It's a nice thing to have. But if you want to come tonight, we will have a bunch of these there for free for faculty. And then if we have any left over, they will be available in the library. So we don't have enough for everybody, but we do have a number of copies of the book. And also, if you didn't get this in Amy's email, there are 2 of the chapters that are photocopied in there. So thank you, and I'm going to welcome Todd again.
Thank you, Martin. I'll try not to forget to remember. I do want to recommend a book, the best book I've read in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've read multiple times now, by an obscure philosopher named Henry Bugby. But I'll recommend that at the end. Could I invite you all, so if Martin brings the mic around, I just thought this would be a good moment to invite you all to offer comments, reactions, questions, thoughts, based on sort of what I shared so far. And then I'd like to return and tell a couple more final teacher stories. And I am going to recommend the Henry Bugby, and I'll tell you why. But could I just open up and see what's on your mind? What are you reflecting on? And
I love the teacher stories. I think they're so inspiring and wonderful. And it reminds me of, in our program, we have students who apply for various scholarships. We have students who are shy and students who are, disconnected. And when we meet them there, just like what you said about the teacher who meets that student in sadness, how that's so transformative for that student. And so when we see students who are really particularly gifted in a certain area, and we encourage them, that student in particular, you should apply for this scholarship.
Yep.
And when they apply and they're successful, it just it snowballs into something that's so big. And then when they leave and go on to get a master's, and they are requesting recommendation letters from us, and they say things like, she encouraged me, and she saw this thing in me. And so I think it's just so wonderful that we are, incubators of these original thoughts and deep thoughts and transformative thoughts that change lives.
It's exactly that. And teenagers, starting at about 15 and up till they leave you, often seem like they really know what they're about and they don't need the adults. But what they really need, I mean, they have these half-formed thoughts of themselves. And what you're describing, I think what some of these stories described is, we show them what the possibilities, so we got to know where they are, like where they're beginning. But then they need help in seeing what can that turn into? What can that become? Even if it's just a program or a book, but it's the belief in them and recognizing them that pulls them along. I think that's teaching. I think that's what it is. Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay to push back, although I hope we'll stay nice and amiable this first meeting back. Anything else on your minds? Brandon?
Everything you're saying, I connect to so much, both as a student and as a teacher. And yet, as someone who does connect with it so much and still believes in everything you're saying, there are times when I have doubt, and there are times when I feel that the experience in the classroom is not doing what you're doing despite my best efforts at it.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about facing those doubts or facing those times when it feels like I'm doing all my stuff that I have tried before that's worked, and it's not hitting the way I wish it were.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the way I coach myself is that I'm always willing to lose when I'm in an endeavor. And like, I want to try really hard, interesting things, but when I write, like I've written a lot of stuff, and some things I've been able to place and get published, and some things don't. But I'm willing for that to happen. And so so I'm really committed to the writing because I think it's worthy and beautiful and noble, and I think teaching's that too. And I'm going to lose with some kids, and that's what other teachers are for. They're going to get my heart, though. That I can give them. And if I'm not the right person to connect with them, that's what our community is for. And we talk, we spend time talking in like teacher teams, like raising names of kids if somebody's concerned about, to see if they're connected to somebody else. And if they are, then I feel, if they're not connected to anybody, then we're really worried. But sometimes, you're the right, you're Miss Able for me, but you're not for that other student. And I think that's just the humility of teaching. If you do end up getting my little book, I have a chapter called I think I call it The Hardest Year I Ever Taught. I was deep into my career, and I moved to a new school in New York. And I was floundering. That was my 17th year of teaching, and I was a good teacher. And I couldn't figure out how to connect and mobilize this group of students. And it was months in. I was really struggling. I was walking around in the city on my cell phone, talking to a colleague from my North Carolina school, explaining what's happening. Like, help, what can I do? 17th year. The humility of being a teacher. And I just stuck with them. And one day, it's October, November, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks into the year, a kid in a conversation mentioned being bullied at their previous school. And another kid responded and reported the same thing. And I was like, wait. And I just said to the group, I was like, did anybody else? Like, and they all started talking about these tough experiences at previous school. And it hadn't occurred to me, we were opening a new school. And this was grade 7 was not a natural entry point to that grade. And these kids had come to a new school to get away from a school where they were having difficulties with other kids. And they were bringing that into the classroom. I couldn't see it. And so what I took to be my ineffectiveness was it was their stuff they were bringing in. And I had to learn that and see it. And then I switched into, I'm like, I need to be in more pastoral mode than in instructor mode with these kids. Like, that's what they need from me, and I need to really pay attention to relationships with it. But I don't know if that answers your question, Brandon. Those are some thoughts. That is what I'm going to talk about with Thoreau tonight, by the way, because, and I'll seed it for you by saying this. I reread in the pandemic, I reread Walden that winter of 2020, 2021, and I was riveted. I hadn't read it in a long, long time. And then I got interested in Thoreau, and I got a big stack of books about Thoreau because I'm nerdy. And I started reading biographies and other books about Thoreau. And then I thought, where is all this in Walden? Like, all these things that were so important to his life weren't in Walden. And he told me at the beginning of Walden it was going to be this intimate book about himself. And all that was not there. And in some ways that triggered me writing this, because I thought, well, that's teaching. Like, I don't see all the stuff that students are bringing in to my class. I mean, I barely see the surface of it, and I still have to reach them and connect them, teach them, and that's the work. Thank you, Brandon. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Say that your stories reminded me and perfectly illustrated how we as educators have the ability to empower our students through knowledge and through caring. And I think that's both an extraordinary thing and a huge responsibility. And so I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
I might add to that. This summer I had the opportunity to interact with a former student, and she just told me how much something I said to her that I didn't even remember saying carried her through some difficult times when she questioned herself. And so that same power that we have, that we don't always realize we have, and that responsibility, the most sometimes tiny little innocent comments can be great aggressions too and cause damage.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I always be aware of what I say so that it's for the good and not to harm?
That's right. I've talked about the romance of teaching before, and somebody's come up to me and said exactly that. Like, what about that? So I'm telling stories about teachers paying attention and doing these things that save a student or put them on a path, and the reverse is true, that teachers can damage students by doing the demeaning or humiliating a student, being overly critical. I mean, you know, all the things that we can do. Yeah, on a bad day. My biggest mistake wasn't in a classroom. I was coaching basketball. And I had a fever, and I had no business. I had a really good basketball team a single year. I was not a great coach. Just had good players that year. We were really good, and I had a fever, and I had no business going to this game. And I coached a game in a bad state, and I cursed at a kid in a huddle, which I would never. I mean, it instantly was. And I hope that didn't have an effect on that kid. But it's that kind of thing of like a little moment like that could be the reverse of what I'm talking about. And I think the hardest thing about being a teacher is the level of concentration required. Like, you are always, you're not off. You're always on when you're with young people, always. And it's exhausting, but you have to be. An ICU nurse or an air traffic controller maybe rival that sort of stuff. Like, you can't not concentrate, but not many others. But thank you for balancing that. Do you have the mic?
So I've got two parallel tracks in my mind going. One is saying yes, yes, everything, I agree, yes. And the other is trying to process, I've taught in K through 12 as well as in higher education, and so I'm trying to process how does this, how would this be manifested in a teacher-student relationship in K through 12 education, and then how would it be processed similarly or perhaps differently in a professor-student relationship in higher education. And I know institutions have different identities and goals, but traditionally I think college plays a different role in students' lives. So how would you think about the emphasis? Does it play out differently in K through 12 versus in higher education, and how would you express that?
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you for that question. I mean, I'm envious of you all because I think some of the clutter of, I taught middle school for life, I've taught every grade 6 through 12. Loved them all. Grade 6 and 11 are the best in that range, but I love them all. There's a lot of clutter that are, supervising hallways with students in them and making sure bathrooms are like they're making the right choices, and making sure you're at lunch with groups of kids, and the demands on teachers as the younger that students get, the range of things you have to do with them, so I think that's in some ways you have a better chance at really focusing on what I think is the formula of great teaching is it's personal, so I'm going to know my students, and I'm going to get to know them and connect with them. And then I know a lot of stuff that they don't know yet, and I'm going to stand on my head to make it interesting, because they may not know if they're interested in what I'm interested in yet, but that's what I'm going to try to agitate to life in the classroom. And then I've got to figure out how to connect them to that. And I think you will have the best opportunity at that. They've finished making some of their, we know, my guess is they continue to make all kinds of foolish mistakes with you all. But boy, what we have to manage with just behavior and developmental things up to that point are significant. But I think at any grade, at any level, it's relationships and then moving students to something else. And we can't, totally control that or predict that. Thank you. I'm so sorry. There's a question on the board. Oh, thank you, Emily. Yeah, anybody else? Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I am very blessed to work at a faith-based institution and with faculty who also are Christians, and I can start my class off with prayer and prayer request. And that's an intimate way to get to know your students. Some students are not comfortable sharing, but some students do, and it also brings the class together. And I had one group of students, it was a small group, but they were so close and so supportive. And if one student was struggling, the class would pray for that student and remind me to pray for that student. And it's just a reminder that, your student is not an island. They have a lot going on in their lives. And we watch TV and know that there's addictions and there's, stressors and high levels of anxiety. And it's just a lot going on, and the students are facing this. And I think if you can pull your classroom to support each other and to kind of unite each other and to help people through struggles. I also think it's an advantage of a smaller school that if there is a crisis, they can take a break and re-enter the program, and these students end up succeeding. And what it reflects on us is that we are promoting our students and encouraging their success. So I do feel like we have that advantage here.
I agree. That's amazing. And I think your attention to building a community in your classroom, you're beginning with prayer and prayer requests, and there are other ways to put ritual into classrooms that build community. I think 100%, I think, is to put the power into the space. Classrooms are a little community. Every single class the student moved is moving into a little community. So how are you going to build community in the space? Anybody else? Okay. Let me offer maybe two more, a couple more little stories. And one I like this, one by a writer named George Saunders, because it talks about it's how teachers talking to teachers, like communities of teachers supporting kids, has an impact. So I like this one. George Saunders, who's an award-winning fiction writer, says, and here again, teacher kept him back after class one day. The simplest move, and we sometimes forget to do it. Kept him back after class. And George Saunders writes, I've forgotten what it was about. I'd said something in class, and he says, whatever it was, the teacher saw something in it and asked me to write it down. It was always better if you wrote it down, the teacher says. It was good discipline. It clarified the thought. And so George Saunders did this. He's a high school kid. And he gave it to his teacher, and then that teacher shared it with another teacher. And that other teacher pulled Saunders aside and told him he should keep it up. Like, you should keep writing things down as they come to you. I mean, the simplicity of that. Like, Martin shared with me what you wrote, and it was kind of amazing. So so my teachers know I want to know when a student writes something that's, extraordinary. I had a 9th grade teacher this year said, you should look at what this kid wrote. And she was right. It was extraordinary. And I wrote the kid a note. So from the head of, from the administrative head, he had no idea. She passed along the paper to me, and then I wrote him a note. When I saw him later with his parents, I had a conversation with them. But the power of that, too, of sharing what we're seeing that's excellent with each other and then each other reinforcing it. So Saunders said the teacher told him to keep writing things down. And he says, now at this distance, I can see how important and unlikely these teacherly interventions were. These were young teachers. They were making lives for themselves. They were surrounded every day by hundreds of us blustering, cynical, musk-smelling 1970s Aerosmith-inflected kids, resisting positive influence. And he says it all could have been different for me, and it would have been. It could have been different, and it would have been, if not for whatever it is that makes an older person, a busy person, a tired person, a finite person, turn toward a young person and say, in whatever way is needed, of course you can, give it a try. And Saunders says, I retain the mute, head-shaking gratitude of someone snatched back from the edge of an abyss. I would have lived, but not nearly as well. Try writing that down. And then another teacher saying to him, that was really good. Nice, it's off. I mean, it's so simple. It's breathtakingly simple. But it's that attention, and then I think it's recognizing the student and then pulling them along. Like when I taught writing for a long time, I really thought about what I was going to put on my comment on a student's paper. And I wanted it to not just be sort of analytical, here's what you did well and here's what you need to do better. And particularly if a kid wrote something really extraordinary, like what do you say to them and then hold them back after class and talk, all those things. That's how people report being influenced by teachers. So don't let those opportunities go by. All right, a quick Tolstoy. So one thing I like about Tolstoy is he also elevates the profession of teaching, because there's nobody who was a greater writer than Leo Tolstoy. He wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina and other things. He was also a teacher. He opened and ran his own school on his estate. And he taught the children of peasants on his land, and he taught them how to write. Pretty nice to have as a writing teacher, Leo Tolstoy. But Tolstoy does something interesting and then he wrote about being a teacher. And he focuses on like what the teacher gets to witness. And what he says, what we witness as teachers, we don't even really have a right to witness. It's so profound and personal. And what he means is he had a student one time. It's a young kid, I think he was 10 or 11, and he was working towards something and struggling. And then the student had a breakthrough and like an insight, and it woke them up and they figured something out. And Tolstoy stood back and watched it and said, he's watching that kid like wake up, come to himself and wake up. And he said, I saw something no human being has a right to get to see. This private awakening of a young person to something large and worthy. That's the other piece of it for us, I think. And it's a little more subtle, because I think what great teachers do is, really connecting with kids, building the community, establishing relationships with students, and then helping them see things they couldn't see, and then helping them figure out how to get there. But great teachers also really delight in watching that happen with their students, like seeing the phenomenon of it happen moves great teachers. And Tolstoy, says, you don't even have a right to see what you get to see. That's how beautiful and mysterious it is. And I think that happens at every level. I had one recently. This was a delightful moment last year. So I don't teach. I don't have an assigned teaching duty right now, but I jump in and take teaching opportunities when I can. And so I ran a book club. I ran a bunch of book clubs last year, but with some middle school students. And there was a book I'd read about that had just been translated into English from Japan called How Do You Live? And I was told it's like an influential book for young teenagers in Japan, and I thought, well, I wonder if we should consider incorporating it. And so I read it, and I wanted to test it out with some middle school kids and did a book group. And I just had a handful of kids in there, and we were plugging away at this book, and it's set in Tokyo. Early in the story, a boy and his uncle are high up in a Tokyo skyscraper, and they're looking down at the street below. And they do what you do. I've done it 100 times in New York City, where I live. Look how small everything is. Look how slow everything's moving, how high we are, and how small. You marvel at that. And they do that, these two characters, the uncle and his nephew. And then I asked the students about the scene, and that's how they described it. And I said, well, what happens next? And they couldn't remember. I said, well, let's go back and read it then. And we went back to it. And what happens in the story next is the boy says to his uncle, this is kind of beautiful. The boy says to his uncle, they're looking down, he says, wait, we were down there earlier. Do you think somebody was up here looking at us when we were down there? We didn't know that. It was just, and this little sixth grade boy, so my readers had read right through that piece, and this little sixth grade boy, I just pointed them to that, and he came forward in his seat. He's like, oh, and I could tell he was just thinking about, like, seeing that and doing that. And he just woke up to that scene, and I thought of Tolstoy. It's like what I'm watching there is the impact of something on a 12-year-old kid. And he's seen what he didn't see before. And all I did as a teacher was like point him back to the thing, and then that's what we do. We facilitate that, and he woke up to it. It's just a gorgeous moment of recognition and a beautiful thing the writer was doing there, right, of taking you back and forth from those perspectives. But that's when that happened, I thought of that Tolstoy, which I know that passage well, the joy of seeing the awakening of students to the things that we're trying to introduce them to. So, all right, again, what I say is to all those people whose response to me is, I could never do that, or here's another line I've gotten, thanks for taking one for the team. Doing that, because who's going to do that? You're doing that. Thanks for doing that for us. I had another friend who he graduated from University of North Carolina. His friends went into banking in Charlotte, and he tried to do that for a year or two, and then he went into teaching. And his little finance bros' response was, good for you, man. Good for you. But so what I want to say, the response to being a teacher should be more along the line of what is it like to get to see what you get to see. What I got to see in that 2-minute exchange with that kid was moving and beautiful and breathtaking. Who else gets to do that, to see those moments? These encounters, and that's what they are, the encounters that students have. And that's the journey, to go back to the Dewey, that our maps are trying to make happen and make efficient and make us responsible and all of that, and that's fine too. But in the service of these experiences that students have of themselves, of us, and of the bigger world. And I know we're under like a zillion pressures. You and I both around budgets and enrollment numbers, the culture battles, the economic conditions, politics, the shifting feelings about schools, and we aren't going to get to will those away. So I'm not, Pollyannish about that. But okay, so inside those conditions, what are we going to do as teachers in classrooms with students? And this is where I think we just need a little more attention to listening to what people tell us had an impact on them, and then making sure that we're at least prioritizing that or elevating that as we can. Okay, my very favorite teacher story, I think, other than my own, other than Miss Abel and Miss Aka, is from Jerome Bruner, who was a professor, psychology professor, but he did a lot of work around educational psychology. Lived to the ripe age of 100 and taught at New York University. And he writes about a teacher named Miss Orcutt, who was another teacher who was a fork in the road. So here's Jerome Bruner. I recall a teacher, her name was Miss Orcutt, who made the statement in class, "It is a very puzzling thing, not that water turns to ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but that it should change from a liquid into a solid." She then went on to give us an intuitive account of Brownian movement and of molecules, expressing a sense of wonder that matched, indeed bettered, the sense of wonder I felt at that age. He was around 10. About everything I turned my mind to, including at the far reach such matters as light from extinguished stars still traveling toward us, though their sources had been snuffed out. In effect, she was inviting me to extend my world of wonder to encompass hers. She was not just informing me, she was rather negotiating the world of wonder and possibility. Molecules, solids, liquids, movement were not facts. They were to be used in pondering and imagining. Miss Orcutt was the rarity. She was a human event, not a transmission device. She was a human event, not a transmission device. I've never read a more compelling little snapshot of what great teaching is than that. This teacher who he experiences a human event and not someone just pouring information into you. I want to read more books about that. I want to hear more about that in school spaces and banners over our doors. Enter here for a human event. That's what you're going to get while we take care of all the other things we have to take care of. Jerome Bruner. Okay, here's how I'd like to wrap up. I'd like to wrap up with you telling some quick teacher stories to each other, and then I'll close with a book recommendation and a really short passage from the book to whet your appetite. But if you would, I'd like to invite you just in groups of 2 or 3, whatever you're comfortable with, quick stories about teachers that were formative for you or that you know of, because I think sometimes we've told stories about great colleague teachers that we've seen. So just a teacher story, one of your teachers, a colleague you've seen, what made them transformative, what made them great. And let's just put that into the space too, and then we'll wind to a close with a little passage from a book. So find a little group, teacher stories of your own teachers or colleagues, and we'll take about 5 or 6 minutes to do that. And Martin, if you would, if we get the microphone, maybe we'll hear a few. So thank you all for your energetic sharing of teacher stories. This is a simple thing to do. It's a good warm-up. We do it throughout the year with my faculty of just a storytelling component in our professional development work. So I'd love to hear if folks would be willing to share just sort of compressed stories of great teachers that you shared in small groups, and we'll take the mic around. Anybody be willing to share for the benefit of the larger group?
Thelma Gaines was my high school Latin and French teacher. She was privately educated in New England. Her husband founded the School of Ed here at King, and he came from California. So here you have these well-educated people amongst hillbillies at Sullivan East High School. And Thelma Gaines signed my yearbook, "You are great. How can you not come to King so I can stay in touch with you?" And I graduated, and I didn't go to King. I went to Northeast State. I was going to do banking and finance, and I was working full-time in the day, going to school at night, and thought I was doing great. And I had a day off, and I went back to see Miss Gaines in October and November. And I still remember where I parked at East High School, and I remember triumphantly walking into the building and just so full of myself, so proud of myself. I'm working full-time. I'm going to school at night. And Miss Gaines was mortified. And I'll just never forget, I kind of loped back to my car. Just Miss Gaines has always affirmed me, and she somehow sensed I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. So I came to King in January of 1982 in a J-term class. Her husband was my advisor, and he put me in a 3,000 level class called Culture and Religion in Communist Countries with Tom Peake. Mostly seniors and juniors. I'm a freshman, just overwhelming, but he was the greatest teacher that I've ever been around. And I became friends with Tom Peake and John Gaines, and after 30 years in public education, I came back to King and was able to have meals with those men and tell them what they had meant to me. But it all started from that simple signature in my yearbook, "You are great."
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Frank McCourt had a student. He wrote a book about being a teacher called Teacher Man, and they were interviewing some of his students. Frank McCourt wrote a note in somebody's yearbook, "What are you going to do with all that talent?" It's the line. Big impact on the kids. Yeah, these little notes, these little comments. Other teacher stories? Thank you for that amazing one. My fellow Bearcat, right? All right. Did you have Miss Acuff, by the way? Okay.
Yes, I'm the other Bearcat, along with Lee. But my experience was here, and my advisor was Graham Landrum. And he was just the best professor. Talked to the students, talked to me. He said, "Why do you want to be a teacher?" And I said, "Well, because I had a lot of teachers in my past who I looked up to. I came up with something." He said, "You need to go to law school." I said, "I do?" He said, "Yeah, don't waste your time teaching." This is Dr. Landrum. He was the head of the English department at that point. And I didn't listen to him, obviously, and I continued and got my teaching degree, graduated from here, and years later, I kept in touch with Mary Landrum, his wife, and after Dr. Landrum passed away, we would exchange Christmas cards, Mary and I, and I have it on my wall in my office now. She wrote me the sweetest note saying, glad you didn't listen to Graham. He would be proud of you.
Nice, thank you. Anybody else?
Well, mine's not a particular story, but kind of a well-rounded account of my younger life. I grew up very poor and with a mother with lots of addictions. So my support never came from home. My encouragement did not come from home. And we were talking about people having a hard time remembering their teachers. And I very fondly remember a lot of my teachers because those positive words of encouragement, the you can do it, the you're smart enough, you're good enough, and you can rise above type things in my life always came from my teachers. Most importantly, my mom upped and we lost our house. I don't know, she was divorcing my stepdad. I forget exactly the term of events that happened there, but we ended up moving towns Christmas of my senior year of high school from Damascus to Glade Spring, which meant I was going to have to go be a rebel instead of a cavalier. And if anyone is from these parts, they know you don't transfer that easily around here. That doesn't happen. No offense to rebels, you can be a rebel your whole 4 years, but if you're a cavalier for 3.5, you don't go be a rebel. So I didn't want to do that, and when I told my then anatomy teacher, and she was also the assistant principal, Miss Lester, that, she lived in Glade, and she picked me up and took me home every day for the spring semester of my senior year and made that huge difference in my life. And all of those teachers, but especially ones like that driving force I have in me to not let their efforts be in vain in my life, that's what drives me. And so the littlest things that we can say to a student can do that butterfly effect, massive change in their life. And it can change your whole mindset. And I'm living proof of that. So we do good things. Keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? One more? It's okay if we don't. There were just a lot of conversations happening, so I'm sure there are good stories out there. Okay.
I had an English professor in college tell me at one point that he knew that I was headed for the Professoriate because I had that lovable, disheveled look. And that was, I've clung to that for many years since. I aspire to live into those words, and that's where we are.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, just close with a book rec and then a really short passage from it. I got put onto this book by a colleague 5 or 6 years ago. It's called The Inward Morning, subtitle, Philosophical Exploration in Journal Form by Henry Bugbee. And he was a philosophy professor, late 40s, in the 50s. And he's a little bit of a mixture of, it was actually from this book that I started rereading, Thoreau, because he's a Thoreau reader. And he's a little bit of a mixture of Thoreau and Zen Buddhism and Heidegger. He's an interesting guy. But he pays a lot of attention to nature and lived out in Montana and fished. And I'm not a fisherman, so this is not like near and dear to my heart. But I read this little passage and I thought, God, that feels like teaching. It's a little portrait of teaching. So I'd close with this little fly fishing picture. And then at the end, the sense of how this is maybe feeds us as teachers too. So he's out west. I recall mornings at the crack of dawn on the Gualala River when we would walk up along one or another on the long gravel bars. As we approached the water in the gathering light, we sometimes perceived all up and down the length of a pool the breaking and swirling of a fresh run of steelhead trout. The day before, there may have been only occasional fish showing, the vestigial dark, darkened from having already spent some days in fresh water. But on this morning, the lower river is alive with new silvery trout, fresh from the sea. And on such a morning as this, there is a temptation to dissipate one's attention over too many fish and too much water. One makes a cast above where a broad back has just been, but even as the drift begins, there is a resounding smack on the smooth surface 20 feet upstream, Then 2 swirls appear 40 feet below. Meanwhile, your partner, clear down at the tail of the slick, is backing out of the river, his rod nodding in sweeping arcs, and a gleaming 10-pounder ascends from the water, almost into the branches of that overhanging pine on the bank opposite him. It is a glorious thing to know the pool is alive with these glancing, diving, finning fish. But at such moments, it is well to make an offering in one's heart to the still hour in the redwoods ascending into the sky, and to fish in one place for one fish at a time. On such mornings, too, one may even catch nothing at all. To fish in one place for one fish at a time, and on such mornings, one may even catch nothing at all. I think of that when I think of teaching, this big teeming stream, but it's like you're fishing for one fish one at a time in one place steadily and patiently. And sometimes they don't bite, to Brandon's point, but you're there fishing faithfully, one fish at a time. That patient, I love the passage because it's about patience and longevity, but just the beauty of it too. And I think teaching is not only, everybody knows it's really important, everybody does, but not everybody knows how beautiful it is to be inside it. And I want to celebrate that and lift that up, what I call the romance of teaching, the beauty of it, of what we do. So thank you all for hosting me. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be back in Bristol. I mean that. Anything I can do to get myself down here and be part of things, I'm so grateful to be back in town. And I wish you all the best for this new school year. And if you come tonight, we'll talk about Thoreau. So, thank you.